To today's session of the Business and Trade Select Committee as we pursue our inquiry into industrial strategy here in the United Kingdom. I'm absolutely delighted to Stevan, to Audrey, for joining us today. Thank you so much indeed for sparing the time to come and talk to us. Audrey, perhaps I could start with you. Just give us a sense as to why your industry needs an industrial strategy.
So life sciences is one of the absolutely key sectors for the UK economy. It contributes almost 40 billion of value to the economy. But it's also one in which there is a growing global market and UK has a comparative advantage. So if we want to take advantage of that and really compete globally, then actually what we need is all parts of the ecosystem in the UK to be firing on all cylinders together, and that requires an industrial strategy to really join up across things like the fantastic science sector that we have, the thriving biotech sector, but also then the larger companies and the NHS, which is a really key part of our ecosystem when we look at how we power R&D through health data, through clinical trials. So that's quite an integrated landscape, and an industrial strategy can help us make the most of it.
How quickly is the life science industry growing at the moment?
Don't have that to hand, I'm afraid.
Okay. So, I mean, the Prime Minister set out quite an ambitious plan for the United Kingdom to become the fastest growing economy in the G7. Do you think we can achieve that without really rowing in behind the life science industry?
As I said, I think it's certainly a really key part of that, partly because you've got to be in an industrial strategy and a growth strategy looking at where you can win globally. And this is one of those sectors where we can win globally. So certainly for GSK, we think there's absolutely no reason not to be super ambitious for the contribution that life sciences can make to that economic growth mission. That does mean then being quite targeted behind that, and I think that's what the Industrial Strategy Green Paper talks about, is really focusing on those sectors. So we think that's the right approach to achieving that.
Okay, Steve Bates, what's your view? Why does the sector need an industrial strategy? Isn't it doing perfectly well without one?
The UK biotech sector was started by Margaret Thatcher's industrial strategy in 1979 with the formation of Celic, a key company at the time, which grew and provided jobs in Slough, and that site has continued for nearly 50 years in terms of developing and great jobs and growth there. So that intersection of what's done in the public sector with what's done in the private sector is really, really, really important for life sciences, because you've got to meld, as you say, the science base from the UK that comes out of universities, not simply that university research, but the translational research. You've got to have a regulatory environment that can do that. You've got to have a clinical environment that can do the tests and the clinical trials that are needed to prove many of the products. And then you've got to have the financing environment, the entrepreneurial environment, the tax environment to do that. Because that is a complex set of things, you need an industrial strategy that brings that together at a time when other countries, China, have made it a core part of their 5-year strategy.
We haven't really had much of an industrial strategy for the last few years. I mean, hasn't the life science industry been doing perfectly well without it for a while?
I think we think that we've been working towards an industrial strategy. Whether that's always been supported by the government or put in lights by a government, I'm not sure it has. I think it's back in fashion now, which is great, very, very important. There's certainly been plans that we've worked to support, and from an industrial perspective, we've always sought to bring those together. And I think the epitome of that was the development of the vaccine task force during COVID, where you saw actually all of the things that were sort of hidden or had been created in the past decade come together to produce a real impact for society.
So what hopes have you got for a new industrial strategy as promised by the government's Green Paper? What kind of difference could that make if the government got it right?
So I think, as ever, the nature of the types of subsector within life sciences that are likely to be developed as a result of the developments in science are changing. We see really big opportunity in the UK in tech bio, which is at the intersection between drug development and artificial intelligence. When you bring those two communities together, that is, in the same way as ChatGPT is changing how you develop language for words or for pictures, you can do the same in drug development, and tech bio is a real opportunity for the global players, and we've got small companies like Relation Therapeutics who are at the forefront of that. So we think there's opportunities because of new subsectors. The other one, of course, is deep biotech, where we're seeing increasing companies looking at applications in the net zero agenda, where you can take engineered biology and use things that have come from that science base in products and packaging, so for instance making stuff out of seaweed-based processes, novel foods and other areas, and those are going to be big expansion areas as we transition from oil.
But why can't you just leave these firms to the tender mercies of the marketplace and let them get on with it? Why do you need government to organise anything?
Global competitors have government support. The American system, the European system, the Chinese system massively support their start-up and scale-up companies with tax incentives, with science support, and if you leave this to the mercies of the market, it's like encouraging people into a very unfair system. The Chinese have been very effective at taking some of the best talent that they've had globally and reshoring that back into China to develop their biotech companies, and they've put capital at risk at large scale. One of the biggest failings that we've had in the UK is we've not backed British science with British cash. We've not been able to put our pension money or our financial services community leaning into British innovation. The vast majority of BIA member companies, great companies like Nanopore, Autolus, Procarium, are funded by American money. We need to have that because if that capital doesn't support locally, then they don't grow to size and scale, and they're at risk of moving as they scale to other markets, and then you don't reap the economic benefit of the core that you've started. You start the companies, but the scale up, which is where you get the real economic benefits, the tax revenues, the growth in jobs, the growth in sales, that is has worryingly been offshored to the States, perhaps to China, and we need to make sure that we can grow that to scale here. You can't do that from a small company perspective alone.
I think it's probably, if I may, worth adding, for our sector compared to perhaps other UK sectors, the timescale and the risk of investment is a fundamental character, feature of this sector. There are probably a decade at least between making very significant upfront investments and the possibility of a return. So it is a sector that is quite unique and has quite I would call a complex relationship with the state. So, we need the regulator. We've talked about the NHS. So if you do just leave it to the free market, actually, I think you don't get that maximum benefit for economic growth. And that's what we're talking about. We're wanting to go from sort of here to here and be really ambitious about that contribution.
But it's difficult to know exactly what that extra benefit looks like.
If I could give a specific example, might help to illustrate. In clinical trials, we've seen actually a drop-off in activity since about 2017. That brings in $1 billion of income just to the NHS a year. So if we were to reverse that, just recover to 2017 levels, you're talking about 500 million revenue for the NHS, obviously a huge benefit for patients in being on those trials, getting access to new treatments they wouldn't otherwise, and a benefit to the economy. So there are absolutely some real, and actually in clinical trials, relatively quick economic growth benefits to be obtained.
Thank you. Chiomora.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for inviting me to guest on this session. I'm the Chair of the Science, Innovation and Technology Select Committee, and obviously the role of the industrial strategy and the sector is key to driving growth. So I just wanted to start with Sir John. You were involved in the life science sector deal under Theresa May's administration, and the sector vision introduced by Boris Johnson's government. So what criteria would you use to judge the success of the government's forthcoming sector plan for the life sciences?
Well, there's the standard metrics of inward investment in the life sciences sector, which is where we actually marked ourselves with the first life sciences industrial strategy. I think we brought something like £3.5 billion in. Government investment was about 600 million, so it's pretty good leverage. A lot of that inward investment would not have happened without the life sciences strategy. There's jobs. There's the competitiveness of our existing homegrown industries, both small and large, which you can measure by the generation of products, overall sales, number of small companies with products. So there's a set of pretty standard metrics that I think you could use in this space.
I think one thing that may have changed since the has increased is certainly regional devolution and the role of the regional mayors and the role. I'm particularly interested in what role you think place should play, whether the sector the industrial strategy and the sector deal need to reflect, for example, obviously the Golden Triangle will probably have attracted a significant portion of that investment that you talked about, may or may not have also been the location for a significant proportion of the jobs. How can we ensure, or should we be seeking to ensure that the benefits and the investment are distributed across the country, and how would you look to encourage and measure that?
Well, so I think what you just said reflects a wide misconception about life sciences in the UK. One of the really powerful things, which we do mention in both of our reports, is that life sciences is spread pretty widely around the UK.
Yes, no, I'm aware of that.
If you look at manufacturing, the Northeast is by far the most powerful domain for life sciences manufacturing. The whole area up by Redcar and those areas, Fujifilms, there's a whole set of really powerful manufacturing capabilities there. And they have been amplified in part by contributions by government to support life sciences manufacturing, which is terrific. Scotland, of course, has a terrific play across a number of different domains. The Midlands are very powerful in medtech, and there's a big medtech cluster around Nottingham extending across to Birmingham. And of course, the Southeast has got quite a powerful space around the big universities in London and Oxford and Cambridge. So it's not the same. If you go to the Northeast, it doesn't look the same as it does in the Southeast, but I don't think that should be our goal. Our goal should be to back the strengths that exist in these domains and make sure they get appropriate support for growth and development, because that is a holistic view to life sciences, which we've always tried to promote.
So how should the sector deal, or the life sector, the sciences sector plan for the life sciences reflect that?
So I think in each of those domains, we need to think quite hard about what the right deployment of government capital. For example, there is now a large life sciences manufacturing fund. A lot of that has actually gone to the Northeast and also to Scotland and the North broadly, and we should continue to support that, because that's, of course, where the skill base is. So if you have the talent base there, then you're obviously going to expand on that in those domains. So I think what we shouldn't be trying to do is to create the Southeast triangle in the Northeast or the Northwest, but we should play to the strengths of both of those places so that holistically as a country we can operate across all the various domains of life sciences successfully.
Sounds like you're quite happy with things as they are.
There's always a risk that stuff will fall off the edge, but I think you should be reassured that there has been a lot of attention from OLS and others who've been behind this to try and make sure that there's attention paid to all bits of the UK when we try and build this out.
Okay, I can just ask Steve now. You mentioned particular areas, particular tech bio and deep biotech, and the government has said it wants to target areas in which the UK has a comparative advantage. Are those are areas that you believe the government has a comparative advantage? How should the government decide which areas to target, and how targeted does it need to be?
So I think the market in life science companies is fertile, and I think we should enable and support private sector provision and support for entrepreneurial companies to decide where to put money. And we have that. We have a very vibrant venture capital community who know how to deploy it. They also know where that's going to sell in the world. So to some extent, I'm not sure that this should be directed entirely by the government. I think there should be the space for private sector initiative. But within that, it's clear that there are areas where the UK does have strength and comparative advantage, and a combination of the venture capital community, the scientific community, the government community can come together and see those comparative advantages. I think if you look at the development of isomorphic labs, which comes out of Google DeepMind in London, the work that was done on protein folding is around really one of the leading companies that's looking at how you then exploit that. I know big companies like GSK have got deals with companies like Relation Therapeutics looking to pioneer in this space. You can sort of see where these spots are when you get people in a room to discuss it as an ecosystem. And that's how I think it's best to prioritise those areas within this. That's how I would get to it. I did see Professor Mazzucato was suggesting that we should have mission-based industrial strategy. I think her view is a misreading of what happened during the COVID period. If you look at what we did at the BIA in getting together companies that already existed in the ecosystem, they came together to help and support Oxford, and then we could then produce something that was scalable for AstraZeneca to take on. That was not delivered by a government initiative. That was delivered by private sector players coming together to produce the right product. So I think there is an element in which you've got to have a degree to which private sector players will help provide the incentive, and of course global players are viewing the whole scene and will know where they think there is comparative advantage or where they want to put money, and having players like GSK and AstraZeneca in our ecosystem enable us also to take their advice, their guidance, and we can see where they're investing.
Just finally then to GSK, just following on from that, so do you know where you're going to be investing? What are the what involvement have you had in the sector plan, and are you confident the government is focused on the right areas, and they will boost growth and investment? And particularly, can I just also sort of reflect? Do you see a regional pitch to GSK in differentiation when you're making those investment decisions?
Thank you. I'll try and tackle those in turn. So I absolutely would agree with Steve in terms of some of the, I'm not sure if subsectors is quite the right term, but some areas of strength, shall we say, in the UK. The UK, I certainly agree on tech bio, or we would talk about the transformation of pharmaceutical R&D from the new technologies available like AI. I'd also highlight genomics, which is a real UK strength based on years of private and public investment, which, John, you may want to comment on. But if you bring those together with the potential of NHS data, you've got something that is potentially globally unique and very, very powerful. So I would certainly say that's an area to focus on. Involvement in the sector plan, so obviously, yes, we engage with government engage with us. I think, Steve, you mentioned Office for Life Sciences. We'd say that's a very expert team that sits across Department for Science and Innovation and Technology and Department for Health and Social Care, and that's a very important feature of the government sort of architecture for us, and we appreciate the work of that team in joining up policy, and as I say, they've got a good understanding of the sector and the issues. Have we got confidence in the areas the government is focusing on? I would say yes. I think we're hearing the right sorts of things about prioritisation, about health data and trials, and manufacturing. The fund was a good step in the budget. So yes, I think so. Regional pitch for GSK. So we already invest a great deal here in the UK. It's an important location for us. We have sites from Scotland and the northwest down to the south. So I think there is a strong regional pitch, absolutely, in terms of that manufacturing talent as well as the strong science base. I think
is it important to have your manufacturing close to your research, or is there not a link there?
There can be a link. So we have a joint site at Ware, which is a new product introduction site, so that that co-location is very important, yes. But not all of them.
Thank you. Matt Weston. Perhaps, John, I could start with you. Just interested to hear your thoughts, really, on what has happened in recent years, thinking in the last 5 years, leaving the EU, the fact that the European Medicines Agency shifted from London, I think went to Amsterdam. What impact you think that's had on UK life sciences, and how you think the sector has been performing since we left?
Yeah, so I think it's actually had a drag on the sector generally, particularly the fact that when the EMA was in London, we had the dominant set of expertise in that space, and we could actually respond probably more effectively to UK regulatory issues than others would have it. When it went to
the UK had more influence on regulatory issues.
We did, yeah, partly because of the people in the agency. When they went to Amsterdam, we've lost that traction. I and others felt that that wouldn't always necessarily be disadvantageous, because a regulatory agency that's freed up to be more agile, more thoughtful, more creative about novel technologies and how you regulate them could be a massive advantage to the UK. And of course that had been positioned as one of the arguments for freeing up the MHRA. That hasn't really played out yet, and I think the MHRA has had a massive downsizing. They've been struggling with trying to keep up with the demand on their services, and I think there's an interesting question now with new leadership whether they can actually pick this up and actually do a better job. There's a whole set of issues in regulation that no regulator globally has dealt with. For example, we're now in a world of prevention. No one really knows how to do a primary prevention trial and get it approved by a regulator. N of 1 studies, for example, those where you use cancer vaccines, where every vaccine you use is different than the last one, they need to be approved, and they need somebody clever to say, okay, we'll accept this, but we won't accept that. So there's a number of these interesting, and these are new regulatory issues because we didn't have these things to test up to now, and now we do. So having a regulator that's on the front foot and thinking about this could attract a lot of activity to the UK and could actually really drive the industry. So I'm optimistic that the MHRA, will get the necessary support it needs from government, but it'll also take its new leadership and get itself to another level. But it's an important question.
Thank you. Mr. Bates and Ms. Yvernault, is it just keen to hear what your experience has been from whether you've had any engagement from the new government over its plan, its determination to reset its relationship with Europe, what the priorities are, and really how it's engaged with you. Any comments?
So as GSK, we obviously engaged with the Department for Business and Trade, who have consulted the sector on that topic. I think they have a fairly decent understanding of some of the areas that could benefit from closer cooperation. To give an example that's a bit of a sort of an overhang issue, if you like, would be the issue of retesting of the batches that come out of UK factories for supply to Europe. So we have to retest them again over on the European side, and it would be very beneficial to have sort of mutual recognition across that. And that feels very achievable and a win-win for both sides. You're also helping to smooth out supply to the EU. So that would be an example.
So I think our main beef has been that the Horizon deal, UK back in Horizon, is helpful from a science perspective, but obviously science doesn't stop when you're becoming an economic actor. Innovation is an important part of that, and at the moment we have a deal where we are in Horizon Europe, but we are not in the innovation part of that, so it's very hard to translate some of that joint science into companies that can grow in the UK. We don't have access to the European Investment Bank. There isn't closeness there, which would make sense given you're doing joint scientific projects to develop the companies and the growth together. We think there's opportunities there. We think that there's strong investment communities like Sofinova who have a foot in European base but have an office in London, for there to be closer collaboration at that point, which we think would drive economic benefit both in Europe and in the UK from some of those joint science projects.
And just how important do you think the trade strategy is? I mean, you know, many of these companies, your company GSK, huge global footprint. How vital is the trade strategy to this sector plan? Perhaps Ms. Evan.
Yes, thank you. So yes, life science exports from the UK is about 24 billion. GSK is 5.5 billion of that, which for scale is roughly equal to the Scotch whisky industry exports in their entirety. So it gives you a sense of the value that there is there. So the trade strategy is therefore sort of slightly obviously very, very important to work very closely alongside the sector plan. Some of the things that are important there are supporting companies in addressing market access barriers around the world. So it's not all about FTAs necessarily, but FTAs are an important part of trying to improve those conditions for companies around the world. We'd also encourage the government to have embed pretty high IP standards in those deals. We, along with some other sectors I'm sure you'll be looking at, you know, we're a knowledge-based sector, and the UK is really strong in that. So if you're going to capture the full economic value of supporting a sector like ours, it needs to sort of follow through in protecting the value of those exports as well. So it's very important that works alongside, and that we also then, I will just refer back also that we're joined up then with the NHS plan. So I think you can see how important it is for these departments to all be working together towards the same goal.
Mr. Bates, also John.
I think that from our perspective, sometimes we've found that the government have approached trade policy as a horizontal, in the way that they talk about it, across sectors, whereas in fact we think that there are some very important sectoral specific issues here. I look at things like whether we could go further with partners who are strong on IP. I'm not sure that the prioritisation of that and how we've talked with Switzerland has been given the prominence that we would see as a benefit there. And I think, as you say, the thinking about this, where you are trading off sectors against each other in a horizontal way, rather than thinking, right, if we're going to support these priority sectors, what do they really need? Would lend you to how do we do that in a vertical way? The horizontal approach hasn't been as engaged as I would have liked.
Mr. John, can I just ask you about the NHS and the importance of that? I think Ms. Yvernault was referencing it a couple of times. How important is the NHS database, but presence vital to attracting inward investment into this sector?
So the NHS broadly across the UK has certainly some of the best patient data and legacy data going back 15 or 20 years, which is digitized. And although it is true to say that not all hospitals yet have digital systems, most of them do. There's only about, I think, 25 or 30 that don't, and they're about to fill that in. So we'll be an entirely digitized system soon. That is a massive advantage, but it is somewhat incoherent in the sense that bits are not hooked up to each other. And I think the reason I say that is during the COVID pandemic, the introduction of a COPI notice, which is a public health legislation that says we now are opening up all the data because it's a public health emergency, demonstrated how terrific NHS data was, because we had GP data hooked up to hospital data, hooked up to testing data, hooked up to vaccine data, and everyone in the world who wanted to know what was going on in the pandemic came to the UK for the UK data. It was unbelievable. But just like an elastic band that you let go of one end, bing, we're now right back to where we were before the COPI notice. And that
why is that?
Because somebody didn't have the nerve to say, guys, this is pretty good. And to be clear, the sky did not fall when we let people communicate with each other about data. But anyway, for whatever reason, we are back to the beginning. And in the UK today, consented patient data, where the patient says, I would like my data to be used for this, is not accessible to people who want to use it for that purpose. So there is a problem, and if you ask me, I had my list of things asks for that strategy, that would immediately open up enormous opportunities for better understanding of disease, better understanding of the best treatments, better understanding of how we get clinical trials at pace. I mean, it's an enormous asset that has massive value to patients, but also to the UK economy, and we are completely walking by it at the moment.
You're suggesting, Sir John, that if we open that back up, extended the elastic band, use your analogy, we could get rapid growth out of this sector?
Massive. I think that's true. You guys, is that? I don't think I'm making this up.
There are lots of businesses that will grow, which is basically about using and engaging with that data. That's how you grow a health data business. And there's lots of opportunity, lots of people who want to do that, and lots of people who invest in businesses that can grow to do that in the UK if we had access to it. And particularly if you made it a priority for UK SMEs, which I'm not sure we've always done in the architecture of how we've built those assets.
That's very useful. Thank you. Rosie Writing.
Thank you. This is all three of you. We've touched on a few points, but in summary, how competitive do you think the UK's business environment is, and what is holding back growth and investment? If I start with GSK.
Thank you. So I think we've got a sort of, I would describe a baseline business environment that's pretty competitive, right? Business tax is about where it needs to be. I wouldn't want to see it get worse, but it's about where it needs to be. We've got good skills, we've got a good science base. There's lots going for us. I think the thing to really take away from today is that there's just so much more competition globally, and that's really accelerated since the pandemic. I think lots of countries have seen, hang on, it's really powerful to have a life sciences sector, and they are being very, I think the word would be entrepreneurial, about attracting that investment. So I think it's a case of, yes, we are competitive, but if we want to really maximise the growth, so if we're targeting that fastest in the G7 sort of level, I would say we need to do more to maximise that growth. In effect, it will get more the more we put in. So it sort of, I start from the end with the end in mind. If the government wants that maximum growth, then let's do even more to be the best that we can be.
And where do you think that competition's coming from, like geographically? Is it?
I mean, lots of places. France have really stepped up under President Macron. Ireland has always been a strong competitor. Singapore, the US, of course, as an enormous market and significant science funder. I'm sure I'm forgetting several, frankly. It's really hotted up. Spain and Australia for trials have made some targeted efforts. So it's a competitive landscape that we're seeing. And I would say we've talked about health data, we've talked about clinical trials, manufacturing is another area that we could maximise growth in as well.
Thank you. Mr. Bates, what do you think the key barriers are to growth in the sector?
So the UK is doing pretty well in the sense that we are the third global cluster for life science, small and medium-sized enterprises. But as Audrey says, there are people who are trying to eat our lunch with specific targeted policies which peel off certain elements of what we've got in terms of success. R&D tax credits have been a central part of support for UK SMEs, as has the work of Innovate UK, both of which are really, really important schemes like the biomedical catalyst. They are competitive, they are hard to get, and R&D tax credits have been focused, which I think is the right thing to do, but that also means that the process by which you've got to get them is hard, and we see other countries bringing in very aggressive R&D tax credit regimes aiming at certain types of certain types of work, particularly around clinical trials in Australia. So we have to be on our mark for that. Policies in Denmark and certain parts of Belgium are very, very clever in how they put together a skills-based mix with a fiscal wrapper. So I think we should always, in industrial strategy, have a look out and see what other people are doing, because businesses make decisions in light of those things. And Singapore has always been a major player, putting a large check down for certain types of manufacturing place. I've talked about the importance of returning home the sea turtles in China. We also see policies like that around entrepreneurs and individuals, particularly in Italy, seems to be working at the moment. So there may be opportunities for the UK to think about UK nationals who may have had a successful business in Boston, Massachusetts. How do we bring them back here, and what's the targeted incentives to do that? So my view on this is the UK is pretty good. English language, rule of law, an existing ecosystem where you can hire not just if you start a company, you can pretty much find a community for your next 10 people, your next 20 people. That is a competitive strength, because we've got people who've been around the block a couple of times. That's really helpful, but we've got to be mindful of where the competition is at. And as other territories have significant clusters, we need to make sure our cluster remains even further ahead.
Thank you. So John, anything to add?
Yeah, so just a couple of quick points. One is, you can look at the competition in the life sciences space internationally, in part related to the amount of industrial government support the different countries provide. So America's right at the top. They get massive amounts of government input. If you look at the budget of the NIH, which is the driver for many of the discoveries in the pharmaceutical industry, it's massive. Now, we're about to see an experiment where that may change, and it'll be interesting to see what actually happens if that does change in terms of the success of the industry in those settings. So that's, but the other countries that do well, Steve has listed them, I won't list them, but they've all had industrial strategies, and in fact most of them have been on the phone to me to work out about our industrial strategy, and then they wrote their own. So Sweden, Denmark, Canada, Singapore, Japan, they've all cribbed our industrial strategy. So, you know, we're okay, but we've got to keep running quite fast to stay ahead. Can I suggest one other thing, though, that Steve alluded to a while ago, and that is we have a really big problem scaling our small companies into big companies. And that absence of scaling capital is a massive drag on our economic growth opportunities. And there have been a variety of ideas suggested. None of them really have delivered, but there is a very big problem, and that is the majority of our potential working capital in the UK in our pension schemes are tied up in government gilts. And government gilts help the government, but they don't help anybody else, I can tell you that for sure. So the absence of having what is trillions of pounds of resource not in the growing economy is a really big problem for our sector, but it's also a big problem for all kinds of other bits of the British economy. So, you know, if you could let me, if I had a magic wand and I could fix one thing, I'd fix that problem. And then you guys could all go home, I could go home, the deal would be done, we'd all be fine. So anyway, that's, I'm trying not to be flippant.
However, if you're managing those bond funds, those gilt funds, is that you don't see a portfolio of people knocking on your door asking for the money. So why aren't companies going out asking for investment finance?
Well, they a lot of that money is in government gilts, actually, basically in treasury. So there's no way to get access to that money. Because
companies are going out.
The money is in gilts for a reason. It's seen as a safe haven, and you need a stable return for pension savers.
Yeah, no, this is a massive misconception. Good returns come from broad asset allocation, deep capital, and long investment horizons.
Well,
That's what the pension industry
we'll put that question to the panel from TheCityUK in a minute or two.
You should do that, because they've not done a great job on this, let me tell you.
We'll let you have that out.
I think they do see the opportunity in life sciences, and of course UK life science companies are doing fantastically attracting capital from around the world. That's why we've got just 95% of it is coming from ex-UK players. We have got fantastic entrepreneurs who are doing really well, competing with the best out of the US, the best out of China for that global capital pool. It's just that what comes when you've got attracted that global capital is the attraction away from the UK market.
Yeah. Okay, Charlie Maynard.
Thank you. So I'm just looking at a couple of charts from the Office of Life Sciences. So in exports, pharma exports since 2013 to 2023, we were number 6 and we're now number 10. Ireland was smaller exports, now triple our exports. Foreign direct investment, we were number 6, we're now number 8, bouncing along sub 1 billion most years. I get the feeling that somebody is eating our lunch, and it doesn't make me happy, and I don't think it's good enough. And I guess trying to, there's multiple reasons for that, but one of the ones I'm thinking is customs union single market, and I'm wanting to understand just kind of, if we were inside the customs union single market, I'm just talking economics here, what would it do for our life sciences sector? So I guess just kind of going, good, bad, indifferent, does it make any difference, or would it be a big help?
Aubrey, do you want to start?
I mean, to be honest, we've adapted to the new status quo, and we're not really looking back at that. As GSK, we're still a large investor in the UK, and I'm not an economist, so I'm not sure.
That's not my question. My question is, if we did go back today, yes, would it be positive, negative, or make no difference to your business in the UK?
I mean, obviously, access to the EU market is a good thing. We'd have to adapt back the other way. So I wouldn't say it would be our top priority if we were to unlock investment.
Therefore, no difference. Is that the answer, or positive or negative? Or you can say, I don't want to answer the question.
I'm not sure I can speculate, honestly.
Okay, don't want to answer the question. Right, Steve.
53% of the global market in pharmaceuticals is the US, 22.7% is the EU. That's the market share. Remember, many of these manufacturing sites are very, very long-term investments, so it's not as if you change the rules that you would move a factory overnight. So yeah. The reason why Ireland had a competitive advantage for a period of time when we were in the EU was that they had tax rates and they had skills packages, and they had regional funds that were particular and specific. Now, if I'm going to speculate, if the UK was back in, the question would then be, what are the tax rates, which are still there? What's the regional assistance position? What's the skills position? And what's the other? And also, how often and which of these are products or services that are where a new decision is likely to be made in the next year? It's a bit more like a car plant or a gigafactory. Some of those figures are reliant on a specific few products, actually. If you look at AstraZeneca and Macclesfield, if you take one product out of that thing, then you move the UK GDP. You look at Denmark's figures, if you look at Ozempic and Novo Nordisk, these are really dependent on some very specific things, and you can move those economics. Now, in my view, what we need to do is make sure that when we're doing antibody drug conjugates in radionucleotides, we've got the company that is absolutely going to knock it out of the park for the world from the UK. They're probably not. It may become a GSK product. It may not be a GSK product today. That's what I would look to do. And then if you got those, you might.
It would help. It wouldn't help, or no answer. Just trying to get to
it would help if you had all of those other factors helping as well.
Okay. And Sir John.
I don't think it makes any difference, actually.
Right. Okay, thank you. The second question I've got, Sir John, is for you, which is you're busy on Genomics England, UK Biobank, and Our Future Health. Which points of those would you most like to pull out and kind of educate us about, which you think would help the life sciences sector most?
Well, I think all three of them have been really interesting opportunities that are unique to the UK, because we have the NHS. We've got a terrific talent base of people who can do these things at scale. And we've had the interaction with industry, which has actually allowed all three of those things to happen at scale. UK Biobank is, with 500,000 people in it and a long follow-up time, is the place to correlate different bits, the proteins that you've got, the genetics that you've got, the imaging that you've got, to understand disease better. And we started that in 2002, and it's been a terrific run. It continues to be a great success. Genomics England was the first effort to try and apply genetics to clinical samples in a clinical setting, and no one else in the world had done that. So we had already got a very strong DNA sequencing industry base that's expanded dramatically since then. It's allowed us to actually implement a lot of genetics in a clinical setting that most other places just do it in a research setting, and that's allowed us to do it in that space. Our Future Health is, I think, probably the one I will highlight. I just come from a board meeting at OFH. This came out of the first life sciences strategy, and it came out of a meeting I had in a room not dissimilar to this with 30 industry people. And I said to them, where is the world going to be 20 years from now? This is in 2017, 2016. And where should we develop capacity that will allow you to do the job better to get to that place? And they said, we think prevention is going to be the game. And we think early diagnosis of disease is going to be the game. And what nobody's ever done is collected a whole population of largely well people down to the age of 18 so that we can monitor and track the progression of diseases, most of which start in your 20s and 30s, to understand how you intervene in those people to change the way we, diagnose disease early, but also flatten that morbidity curve. So as you know, we're now, I think we're very close to 1.5 million people recruited in that study. We've got 2.3 million people consented, and somewhere in the process, we're headed for 3 million. We hope to get to 5 million. It is the world's biggest cohort, and it is providing really interesting opportunities for people to explore the concepts of prevention and early diagnosis. So it's created, there was no market in that place. Now it's started to create a really big market. So I think we should be really proud of those things, because that's exactly the sort of thing that an industrial strategy where government is involved, but also where industry is involved, and where our really powerful academic community is. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, look, it sounds like we've got a lot of the assets in place, but I want to just sort of set up our punch up with TheCityUK and those from the financial services industry a little in slightly sharper terms. So Sarah Edwards, do you want to just talk about some of the questions we have about mobilising capital?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. we've heard on this committee how challenging it can be to access finance. So I wondered if I could start with you, Mr. Bates, about what challenges do you see startups face in accessing finance and that ability to scale up? In the West Midlands, we've already talked earlier about there being, for example, a med tech sort of ecosystem there. So companies are going to be wanting to know how do they do that, but we know that that's not easy. So could you sort of speak to your experience about what are those challenges in specifically for life sciences?
I think there are challenges at all stages of the journey of starting a company. I think that the UK is not a bad place to start a company. There are some good schemes and some great accelerators that can get you going. And in a sense, raising money should be hard, but we have schemes for angels, EIS, VCT, SEIS at an early stage. Because of the quantum of capital that you need in life sciences, you've got to get to some pretty big numbers. I think, so John, you've used the example that you need to invest £1 billion to make £20 billion. So you've got to think about a series of investors who can go to that level, £1 billion before you make any money, before you start for global company size. So startup you can do, but then you need people who can come back in and go the next round. The British Business Bank are making a crack at helping ensure that we've got a venture capital community that can do that, but that venture capital community is small, and it can't do everything, and also it is not as geographically diverse as befits the sector. We have some good players in the north, a couple in the Midlands. The majority are based in London, but people go looking for money where there is money. So I think that's. But then the big problem is when you really want to scale up and compete with the Americans, and this is the sort of 10 million, 50 million B, C, D rounds and onwards, and that's really where we haven't been able to as yet develop enough of a community that can scale those companies. We're not going to do thousands of those a year, but if we do a few of these, they are the ones that will take the opportunity from our Future Health and others and be in 20 years' time world leaders. That's what we're trying to do, 1 or 2 world leaders at scale. So I think it's understanding that continuum, and particularly it's the ability to take risk and go again at that scale-up point. We have some companies that go to NASDAQ, the American exchange, and effectively compete there, but it's that scale-up point which there isn't a public market in London that supports at this stage to do that. But that's where I would say the biggest problem is.
So just to clarify, Mr. Bates, that's kind of 50 to 500 million?
Yeah, I mean, I think 200 million would probably, 50 to 200 million is where I would put it.
Thank you. Well, that leads me into one of my other questions, and I wonder, Audrey, if I could come to you. So we've just heard the ballpark figure of 500 million. So the government's allocated 520 million, so you can have an extra 20, to support manufacturing in life sciences sector over the course of the Parliament. So do you think that's enough? And if not, why not? And what else might you be looking for?
I think it's a very good start, particularly considering there's obviously choices to be made in the Treasury. If we compare with France, President Macron put in 1.5 billion euros. So it's not quite there, but it's, let's say, ballpark, not bad. I think what we could do to strengthen that offer for manufacturing is more around process, actually, as well. So we need to be giving a good proportion of the funding for a manufacturing plant up front to de-risk that. Even for large companies, you might be surprised, but even for large companies, these are significant capital investments to be made. So, and there are geographical choices. So that's one point. Making decisions relatively swiftly and giving companies certainty that they'll get that support early on enough that the business case inside the company is made and you can go ahead and make that decision with some certainty is important. And I'd also suggest looking at the criteria. So other countries are pretty good at recognising that in advanced manufacturing, actually it's more about the capital investment than necessarily lots and lots of jobs. Obviously there's very good quality jobs, but the number is not so significant. And also I think we need to do a better job of looking at the big picture for a site. So it's not necessarily a specific sort of this year we're investing this much in this particular site, but actually what's the story of that site? Are you upgrading the technologies there so that it's viable for the next 40 years? And is that linked to another investment that's coming in a couple of years' time? So I think we sometimes look at each individual RON rather than looking more holistically at maintaining a site, growing a site, as well as sometimes there's quite a big focus obviously on bringing a new investment, but actually we need all of those things.
Thank you. And one last question then to Sir John is you've talked about pensions as potentially unlocking some money and in your thoughts on that. So what are the other steps that the government might be able to take to sort of mobilise capital and crowd in investment in your view?
I think pensions are an obvious place to go because there's a very large quantum of money there. And I think it's really important to remember that the government provides a massive tax benefit for the pension money that's sitting there. And I don't think it's unreasonable to ask pension trustees and pension funds to acknowledge that as they're distributing their. And I'm not saying the money should all come to biotech. Don't get me wrong. That would be a bad idea. But there are lots of places where people can earn significant returns on money if they invest it in the way I've described. And in fact, you can look at any major endowment management that has got a long time horizon and the depth of capital that allows them to distribute it across multiple asset classes. And they routinely return 8 to 10 to 12% every year. Compare that to what you get from gilts. So this is not just about getting the country growing. It's about giving people decent pensions. And, I think everybody has to be worried about where people are going to end up in the modern world when they cash their pensions into the age of 65 now. It is not going to be pretty. And in the end, it'll be the government who ends up bailing it out. So I do think there needs to be a more thoughtful approach to how we use our capital assets to grow them and grow the economy along with it.
Okay, thank you. We're going to turn now to one of our favourite themes, which is the lack of joined-up government.
Yeah, absolutely. So just finally, we're keen to look at the governance and oversight of the industrial strategy. Frankly, how do we make government function alongside industry? So perhaps to start with you, Sir John. You mentioned in previous answers that you speak to other countries. So be keen to get, frankly, what do you say to them? When you are talking about the life sciences sector deal, the problems that you've encountered, the problems you've seen, the opportunities and challenges that are there.
So one of the interesting things, and I've had the opportunity most recently talking to the Canadians, is that the Canadians have got a single-payer healthcare system, as we do. They put a lot of money in it. It's about the same percentage of their total government spend. And I was in the room with some leading Canadians, and I said, what are your expectations about your health system contributing to economic growth? And they looked at me and they went, what is he talking about? Of course it's not going to contribute. And I said, have you thought about this, you folks? Because if the taxpayer is putting in a very large amount of money to deliver health care, would you not expect that there should be some effort to make sure that that actually helps float an economic agenda? Anyway, it's quite interesting because not everybody has got the approach that so the NHS, I think, gets they get the economic growth agenda, they get the life sciences strategy, and they have been helpful in many settings. Have they been perfect? They absolutely haven't been perfect, but it's been okay. Part of the reason that we've been successful, though, is, and this goes right back to Peter Mandelson and Paul Drayson, was the creation of the Office of Life Sciences, which is a cross-departmental civil service entity that bridges, and it's had various names, of course, but basically bridges business with the health system. And that is not always easy, but I have to say they have, in my time, done an amazing job of stitching stuff together, getting people to look at problems together across government. And as you know, getting departments in government to work together on anything is not an easy job. And so they deserve some kind of medal for that because it's been really impressive. No one else has got that. They've often asked me a lot about that because they've often thought about how they would do that, but no one's managed to match that. And I think it's a really important piece of the puzzle.
Why don't we then focus on that piece just as you finished up? Mr. Bates first. What government departments have you spoken to about the industrial strategy, the life science sector plan? Are they all on the same page?
I would agree with Sir John. I think the Office of Life Science are doing a good job in pulling the various pieces together. Obviously, we see changes to government departments, new establishment of DSET, how that works with DBT. I think the Life Science Council, which Sir John chairs, has also been a long-standing, nothing's perfect, but a long-standing council that the key players, large, academic, small, have bought into, and that has also been an important part of the architecture. And I think actually it's one of the structures that other sectors are looking at. So deep scientific, deep sectoral knowledge, longevity, and a secretariat in the OLS that can drive it, I think, have been important parts in pulling this together. I think we've spoken to most of the departments all across the UK.
To your experience, Ms. Yvernault, about
yes,
speaking to the UK government, do you get, you speak to different departments, do you get different answers? Can you navigate that?
To not bore you with exactly the same answer, I endorse what's been said, but I'd also really praise the close working relationship with the two Secretaries of State across DCIT and DHSC. I think they are very closely aligned on the vision they have for the sector. And also, I think correctly, the Health Secretary has stated that the Department of Health is an economic driving department and has taken Secretary of State level responsibility for life sciences. Those are all really welcome statements and intentions. Completely agree with Sir John about the role of life sciences and health on the economy, and also I'd just add there, if we think about an ageing population and how we have to make the most of every worker that we have, I'm sure the committee will be interested in skills as well, but of course we have to maintain the health of that workforce, so that there is actually a triple benefit here in my eyes as well. So.
Well, that's a remarkable note to conclude on, isn't it? That all departments are pulling together in the same direction and there's no dissonance between departments and regulators. Is that seriously what you're inviting us to believe, Mr. Bates?
I think that they've done a good job in using the Office of Life Science as a way of coordinating that. It is hard. We do see difference between positions in Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain with regard to regulation, which are hard for business to navigate. I've talked about the challenge of seeing trade in a non-sectoral session, but I think of all the sectors, I hope that people would look at the Office of Life Science and the Life Science Council as a way in which to do it, and that's perhaps why we've got a leading world-class sector in the UK.
Okay, so potentially a model for other sectors. Thank you very much indeed. That's been extremely helpful. The committee is very grateful to you for your time and for your evidence. That concludes this panel. Order. Panel in our inquiry today, looking at the industrial strategy of the United Kingdom and looking at those sectors which have been nominated as special growth driving sectors by the government in its green paper. The first question we'd like to put really is about whether you think the Prime Minister's target of becoming the fastest growing economy in the G7 is possible, and whether you think your sector is going to be growing faster than the overall rate of economic growth or not. Miles, maybe I'll start with you.
So we'd say the Prime Minister's target is possible. It could be done. I mean, it's not entirely in the gift of UK government. So it's a bit like your favourite football team. They might invest heavily in their performance, but you don't know what your competitors are going to do. So there is that element that is outside the Prime Minister's and this government's control. But we would say, if you look at a number of the immutable advantages the UK has got, time zone, language, etc., the talent pool here, the direction of travel of the industrial strategy, a lot of the indications and sentiment that has been put out by the Chancellor around regulating for growth rather than risk, which we're extremely supportive of, and also just quite candidly the position, certainly from our industry's perspective, of some of the UK's major competitors. Yes, the UK is in a good position, but we don't think we should be complacent in any terms at all. There are a number of challenges. We do need to make sure that we will need to navigate properly what's going to be a tricky geopolitical and international regulatory environment, and the UK is at its best when it is an open economy. I think the governor of the Bank of England described free trade as being in the British DNA, and it is something that is a natural advantage for the UK. But all of those put together, I would say that medium to long term, I'm an optimist, dependent on us not being complacent.
Thank you.
Likewise, we are optimistic. We believe that the growth mission is possible. I'd also like to just refer to one of your previous questions, whether the industrial strategy is necessary. Yes, it is absolutely necessary. We believe, why? Because the advertising industry that I'm here to represent is the driver of growth, and we are doing as well as the entire economy, and only if the UK economy is doing well, we will be doing well as well. So yes, we are optimistic. However, there are certain shortfallings that we believe we could be addressing, mostly in the regulatory field, but also in investment in AI in particular.
Okay, thank you. Ramon?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's an ambitious target, but I think I share Miles and Steven's sentiment that we are in a very strong place. I'm particularly pleased to see that the PBS sector has been recognised. I mean, we are a powerhouse of a sector. You think of the diverse, broad church of industries that we've got within professional and business services. We're talking about lawyers, accountants, architects, designers, but we've also got a fantastic regional footprint. So if we think of it, a firm like EY, we're in 22 locations across the breadth of the UK. But in all of those locations, we also have SMEs that have the potential to thrive in our sector and also really grow. So I think providing dedicated support and a roadmap for the PBS sector could be a real lever for growth.
Is it possible to define the PBS sector, or is it just too amorphous?
If you go with the Professional and Business Services Council, they would include the broad church of architects, designers. It's very broad. They exclude financial services, so I think we have a slight definitional difference between how the TheCityUK would refer to it. But in terms of the PBS as sort of defined by government, we are representing 17% of the workforce, over 500 million firms, and we are looking at 5.4 million jobs, so we're a significant sector.
And just to comment, I wouldn't actually disagree on that specifically. So it is very diverse. We represent related professional services, so it is management consultancy, accountancy, legal services, which we see as part of the cluster, the ecosystem of financial and related professional services. But I'd agree with Ramon. This is a massive national success story. It's a massive national strategic asset, and it's something we do very well as a country.
Thank you. Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Is the UK an exciting market for professional and business services? And if not, why not? And if I could start with Ramon and then work along the committee, please.
I think it is. The fact that in terms of exports, we're second only to the US. If I could just give some numbers, it's 185 billion in exports last year. It's 21% of UK exports. So it's an exciting and diverse industry that is successfully exporting. And also when we think of inward investment, when we look at EY do an annual attractiveness survey that looks at the sentiment and appetite of foreign investors to invest in the UK, repeatedly this is a sector that people are drawn to as well. So I think it is an exciting sector. Thank you.
I would agree, and we actually have some research done by WPP-BAV. There is a survey that went around 89 countries asking people from across different demographics, including business decision makers. And what 82% believe they want to invest in the UK. But when they look at the UK as whether a UK is open for business or not, UK is ranked at the place of 37, whereas France and Germany would be in around 20th place globally when business decision makers are asked. And the main driver of their reluctance is so-called bureaucratic burden, so to say, which goes down again to the regulatory burden that sometimes is perceived by potential investors. But yes, this is a big market in the advertising world. It's the third largest in the world. 40 billion advertising spend annually in the UK. Not only that, there is 2.4 million jobs supported directly by the advertising industry. So there is a breadth of talent that supports that vision.
Thank you.
I would agree with Ramon and Stevan. I mean, I think we're in a really exciting position as the UK. The point has been made, we're the second biggest exporter of services in the world. I think the FT described us as the Saudi Arabia of services exports. You can look at that as positive or not, but I thought it was quite a good shorthand. We're the only G7 economy where services exports outstrip goods exports. If you look at management consultancy, that has grown almost double over the last 10 years in terms of its growth and its exports. If you look at legal services in the UK is bigger than automotive. It is growing by double digits pretty much most years. It's 80% growth over the last 10 years. Biggest single international legal services sector. And the point I'd make is that if you look at some of our major competitors in this space, and I think particularly of the United States, those are massive domestic markets. And the UK, because it's a terrific market, but it's a market of only 70 million people, has to think about exports. Any company that is growing in the UK has to think about exports really, really quickly, which is why the connection between the industrial strategy that we're talking about here today and the trade strategy, and I was delighted to hear this in the earlier conversation, is so important.
That's great. Thank you very much. And so picking up on that point, so how successful do you think the UK has been in attracting investment into the professional services and the business sector compared to international competitors? So where would you put us on that sort of global ranking?
I'd say we're pretty successful, and the sorts of firms that are represented at this table and elsewhere, I think, are a fantastic example of that. And again, to look at legal services, I think all of the world's top 40 largest legal services firms are represented in the UK. And that is partly because English law is such a fantastic platform about which we ought to be making more. So we are good at that. I think one of the challenges, if I'm very candid, that we've had over the last 10 years or so is that we've been very successful against a deeply challenging and unusually challenging backdrop. So the UK has looked politically unreliable for about 10 years. And a lot of that people immediately assume is connected to, say, the Brexit referendum, and that was a factor, and the uncertainty that came out of that. But also it goes back, frankly, to the Scottish independence referendum of 2014. The UK, and we've had this from a number of international investors who've made this point to us directly, could be relied upon to be predictable. It could be relied upon to be almost a little dull, but you'd get good returns there. And so that lack of policy stability, the lack of tax stability that's come off it, the lack of regulatory stability has been a drag factor. And we've heard that directly. And a number of companies have pressed pause on investment decisions, or what that actually leads to is a sum of money doesn't sit to one side waiting for the UK to become an investable place again. What happens is that sum of money goes elsewhere into another investment opportunity in another part of the world. So the counterfactual is hard to point to. So we have been very successful. We continue to be successful. I will urge throughout today, and always do, about the risks of complacency. But there have been some background sentiment noises that have made the UK harder to invest in than historically it has been.
Thank you. And one last point then, just to pick up on that point, I guess, in thinking about, so the government obviously has laid out its industrial strategy, its trade strategy, but also elements domestically, including procurement, and thinking about how that can be used. I think that's got a lot of benefits for the entire country, and looking at where growth can be maximised across communities. So in your view, could the government be smarter about how they use public procurement, for example, and bringing in that sort of supportive growth factor across the sector?
So colleagues on the panel may have views as well, but from our own point of view, absolutely. And it was good to see the Chancellor making her announcement about streamlining the procurement process around defence, for instance. So that has been a challenge. We know for a number of SMEs, I know we're talking about professional services here, but just as an example, one idea that we have floated with a number of members of the committee that we've talked about is actually helping the connectivity in terms of finance between what the public sector, for instance, needs and what the private sector can provide. And so, one of the challenges that we have is, for instance, just very basically, how a prospectus is built together for an investment opportunity in the public sector. So investors, private sector investors, tend to look for a particular kind of term sheet or prospectus or something else, and often the expertise to do that and provide that doesn't exist in the public sector. So we think there is a role for the private sector working with the public sector, for the industry working with government to try and find a way of bridging that, and crowding in private sector investment off the back of that. And we're very happy to brief committee staff and committee members outside this meeting on that.
Just that point harder for a moment. So you're saying that there isn't really a well-established, well-defined pipeline of investable propositions with nice and clear term sheets that is already nicely set out for investors to come and take their pick from.
Absolutely, and that is a key part of the problem, and it's something some of our competitors do extremely well. So I'd point to Singapore as the obvious example, but also I'd say France tends to do this better, not always perfectly, but they tend to do this better. What any investor is looking for is what is the term sheet here, and are you ready to go? Which is one of the reasons why the planning reforms that have been put forward by this government are so welcome, because people will not sit around waiting for something to take place. They will, as I say, they'll deploy the capital they've got to generate a return for the owners. But the term sheets are absolutely critical. Without that, shovels don't go in the ground.
And we could contrast what has happened in the UK with the past with the approach that, for example, President Macron has taken to driving inward investment.
Yes, absolutely, and this is something, and I think it's become almost a sort of joke that there are more people, there are fewer people who don't have President Macron's personal mobile number amongst international investors than actually do. The events they hold each year in the Elysee are probably best in class, although I would say the government's Global Investment Summit is catching up with those pretty quickly. But to give one example, we've been told that President Macron sits down on a regular basis, I believe monthly, with French defence firms and the French chiefs of staff to talk about how they can drive exports and what government can do to support that. And the reality that we sense from the conversations we have with international investors and just from what we're seeing in current events is that the links between and the strategic direction between industry and government are going to be far closer than any time they've been since the Cold War. And that is something the French have a bit more muscle memory on than we do.
May I just add something on the public procurement point? So there are two ways that public procurement can help. One is working with companies and actually investing in those emerging technologies that will be drivers of growth, such as AI. So working with companies that actually have implemented AI in their workflows. And two, public procurement can align their purchasing with some of the overarching government goals of growth, which is sometimes there is a sentiment that the public pound here is invested in companies who have their workforce elsewhere, offshoring, whereas there are many companies who operate and have their onshore, their work staff in the UK are sometimes excluded from the public procurement process based on cost.
Do you think there should be more conditions on public procurement to, for example, support local jobs in the UK?
Yes.
Okay, is that a shared view, Ramon?
I don't really have a view on that one, to be honest.
Okay, Martin?
I think it would depend on what the circumstances are and to what extent you're choosing to bring in private sector capital to support that. Ultimately, the firms that we represent don't own that capital. They are custodians of that capital, and they have to deploy that capital to generate the best possible returns for the owners.
Weston.
Can I just go back to the point you were making about our reputation? We had a very platinum level reputation several years ago, particularly in certain services that you were talking about. You said that we'd been damaged, I think, is how you put it. What needs to be done to restore that, given it's such an important part of our economy?
So stability, policy stability and predictability is absolutely key. So that would be the first one that I point to. And I think that is something the UK has been better at over recent years. And it's something that we've certainly seen in our interactions with international partner governments and international partner companies and industries. So I think the UK has made progress on that. I think if you look at the tax system is, we can talk about the level of tax, but it's overly complex. So I've worked at two large British multinationals that would, as a matter of course, regularly review domicile Tax would be one of 20 or 30 different factors that we would look at, and everyone assumes that what you're looking at there is tax rate. And as I say, that's part of it, but it's the fact that the UK is now, compared to most of its OECD or many of its OECD competitors, more complex than the OECD average and becoming more and more complex each year. I think the tax code from recollection now is 2 million words, and that is a cost in and of itself. So navigating that, staffing up for that becomes a challenge for companies and becomes a drag on competitiveness. So we point to that, and also some of the decisions that we've seen from HMRC and indeed from the courts recently that have effectively retrospectively changed tax treatments. A huge problem. The Spanish solar industry took years to recover and arguably never really did recover from the retrospective removal of tax support for solar panels in Spain. So that predictability is absolutely key. Okay. And then just the final one I'd point to is the sense from international investors that there is a longer-term policy stability that they can depend upon over 5 to 10 years. And that is something, again, if I look at Singapore to a certain degree, some of our European competitors, they've done better than we have in recent years.
Just building on Miles's point on stability, I mean, he's absolutely right. Businesses love certainty. And I think one thing that is positive from the industrial strategy is the first time in a long time we see a dedicated 10-year plan. And not only have we got 8 sectors that are high growth that are identified, there's a real concerted effort to think about those key enabling sectors around infrastructure, skills, education and transport that are going to be fundamental if we are going to have a successful strategy that then delivers against that very ambitious target to have the highest growth rate in the G7.
To you, WPP, particularly interested to hear what your thoughts are on the barriers that we face in terms of trades in services, what sort of barriers there are and what the government needs to address those. Can I start with you?
Yes, the main barrier that we see is really perception and reality of the UK enacting regulation. So, and I think, or additional tax burden. We have witnessed the national insurance contribution rise. Then if we look at what the government is proposing, starting from additional reporting requirements for publicly listed companies to new laws in the employment rights, etc., there is a continuous flow of new regulations, and companies such as the company that I work for continuously have to invest even more and more resources into understanding the law and then complying with the law. And those resources are the resources that are really basic for us to be able to invest in growth opportunities such as AI that I bring.
Sorry, to be clear, in terms of selling services into other countries, WP has a huge footprint globally. What barriers are there in terms of selling UK-based professional services elsewhere? Is that something that you have experience in?
Not really, because as you said, we do have the global footprint. So we have over 100,000 people globally operating in more than 90 countries. So we do have a footprint in every country. The trade barriers as such do not always impact us. What does impact us are the trade barriers in tariffs, and because it impacts the broader economy. And if companies and if the consumer confidence goes down, they are unwilling to spend. Companies are naturally withdrawing some of their money from their marketing budgets, and therefore that impacts us and our ability to grow, and the economy's ability to grow.
Okay, is the UK?
So from our perspective, it's slightly different. So a lot of the firms that we work with, you are dependent on a number of professional qualifications, and so mutual recognition of professional qualifications becomes a challenge. There are ways of working around that, including some of the methods that WPP have adopted. But ultimately, a lot of this is about the ability to, in essence, fly in and fly out, as it's termed, to provide services. But broadly speaking, it tends to work quite well. One of the things that I would point to that is more and more of a factor is data. Servicification of exports, which you'll be very familiar with, means that a lot of manufacturing firms will essentially use their goods as a loss leader, but make their money on the maintenance contract on a jet engine, for instance, or something like that. But what is common to both goods and servicification and sole services companies is that data is now as important, certainly for our financial services members, as capital is. So data localization becomes a real problem, and the ability of data to flow across borders with minimal impediments is increasingly a challenge at a time when a number of jurisdictions are approaching data in a much more restrictive way, including for national security purposes.
In terms of priorities for any trade negotiations, MRA is the priority.
MRAs are a huge advantage, and digital economy agreements are a huge advantage. And we would say that the era of the sort of big ticket, fully comprehensive free trade agreement is probably largely behind us for a number of pragmatic reasons, as well as the political circumstances that we're in globally. But that doesn't mean that we can't do things such as have been done on the Swiss UK financial services mutual recognition arrangement, the moves that have been made in India on opening up the Indian market to British lawyers, the digital economy agreement with Singapore. So actually we think there's a lot more that can be done, and often the nature of those sorts of arrangements and agreements is that they are much better suited to services than FTAs, which, as my colleagues on the panel have already pointed out, tend to be much more focused on goods.
Okay, Ramon?
I'd just add to that. I mean, data is absolutely critical. So the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement has been critical for mutual recognition of standards and allowing personal data to be shared across the UK-EU border. Similarly, the Atlantic Declaration in the US is a really important agreement. So the more we can get data moving freely, that's absolutely critical to the success of our sector. And then similarly on access to skilled talent, mutual recognition of qualifications is very important for us as well.
Any concerns about the tariff landscape that we're increasingly facing, on what that might do in terms of your provision of services globally?
I mean, so far the other panellists have views. I mean, most of the language and focus of rhetoric has been around provision of goods. There's been less conversations around tariffs. I mean, particularly if we look at the US, we have such a closely intertwined relationship that is mutually beneficial. That it's in both parties' interest for that to continue.
I'd say that Stevan's touched on tariffs are a sort of background context problem for the industry, for professional services, because they point to the raising of barriers between jurisdictions. We tend to find that, as I've touched on already, when there is greater ability for capital to flow, for people to move between markets, for regulatory barriers to be reduced, for the avoidance of regulatory arbitrage, that is a positive for an economy like the UK that tends to have to be much more open, much more nimble, much more small L liberal. So the backdrop to this, I think, is concerning in terms of the direction on tariff, but direct impact on professional services of tariff barriers tends to be more limited. It's the sort of canary in the coal mine factor that it tends to bring with it.
Okay, thank you. Tony.
Thank you very much. To the panel then, we've spoken a little about some of the domestic barriers to growth, but I wondered if you'd perhaps like to expand on what you see as the factors that may be holding back growth here in the UK. Mr. Celic.
I point to that there's a massive cultural problem. There's no getting away from that in terms of the UK's approach on risk. And we have, for very understandable reasons, we have sought to push risk out of the system, or at least minimise risk. And we have sought, as a society, to basically tell regulators and politicians that we should move from a world of caveat emptor to caveat vendor. And so, as the Chancellor put it in her Mansion House speech in November last year, and I've already touched on, we need to move to a position where regulators are being told to regulate for growth rather than regulating for risk. And certainly we've seen, in terms of some of the post-Brexit changes, that a direction of travel set by government didn't always survived contact with how that instinct or that impetus was implemented by individual regulators. But that is not, to be clear, to beat up regulators unfairly. All the regulators are doing is following the direction of travel that has been set for them by society. So we would absolutely point to that as a critical challenge. I think, therefore, having, and this was touched upon in the previous panel, having a real clarity between what government is doing on a cross-departmental basis, what government is doing working hand in hand with regulators and other public bodies, and how it is working with the private sector in deliverance of, in furtherance of the delivery of the government's targets on growth, I think is absolutely central. This has got to be a national effort, and it's got to be something that brings together all parts of the UK to deliver that. It is going to require a Team UK effort to make it work.
Let's just pick that point up very quickly. So if 10 is completely seamless between government departments and government and regulators, and 1 is just a complete catastrophe, where is the UK at the moment?
I'm genuinely not trying to dodge the question. I think it depends which bit of government and which regulator you're talking about.
Let's take the financial services sector.
Okay, so if I was looking at financial services, I would say connectivity between where regulators and government are is 7 and rising.
Okay, interesting. Higher than I thought.
Mr. Randjelovic, would you like to comment on the points about barriers to growth? You've already said a little. Is there more you'd like to add?
Just to add, I fully agree with Miles, and thank you for pronouncing my last name so well. It's not so common. The one thing that I believe all regulators and the government should have in their mission statement, so to say, it's not only growth, it's also innovation. Because we can't just regulate against risk, and I think the EU has seen that approach is not always working. They're scaling back on some of their regulation, so it is pertinent for the UK's growth mission to have that innovation also in their mission. The other thing I would just like to highlight is I don't know if it's a proper barrier, but it's something to think about, which is how to upskill people and how to ensure that we are upskilling people for the next industrial revolution, which is already happening thanks to the AI. And we are hopeful that the newly created Skills England and also the levy that is replacing the apprenticeship levy is going to contribute to that by having a much better input by the industry on what is needed and allowing us to use the money that we're paying into the levy pot for the on training that we actually need and not the training that we are provided by the training providers. And
following up on 2 of those points then, firstly, have we got the balance between risk and innovation in AI correct? And we may be straying into the domain of other committees there, and it's a shame she isn't here. But particularly, I know that's partly your expertise, and I'll appreciate your thoughts on that. And where it comes to skills, I'd appreciate thoughts on what the skills shortages that your sectors are facing. But Ms. Kaur, I'll also come back to you on barriers, but we'll start with Mr. Randjelovic.
So on AI regulation, the previous government has started very well with outlining 5 or 6 different principles which every regulator needs to take into account, and we are fully behind that. There is no need for an overarching big piece of legislation. We don't need to regulate AI as a technology. If there is a need for regulation, we need to regulate some of the riskier use cases that may exist. So I know that the government is currently thinking hard how to do that, and I know it's part also of the conversation with the US. So the approach of having the principle-based approach, allowing the technology to actually grow and evolve, is something that we are very supportive of. In terms of skills shortages, the economy of tomorrow and actually the economy of today requires that interdisciplinarity, which is a combination of creativity, especially relevant for the advertising industry, together with technology. And that is not always something that is given, not only by the existing university programs, but also by the training that is available. So that's why we need a better influx of training providers supported by the levy that would allow our companies to train our people at that intersection and interdisciplinary disciplines.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kaur. Barriers and skills.
Yeah, so on barriers, I think the regulation point is a valid one. Right. I think the FCA, how it approached its growth and competitiveness mandate has been very positive, and certainly lessons can be learned as other regulators, a government works with other regulators to look at how they want to approach the issue. The one thing I would note, though, is when we looked at our sort of EY attractiveness survey and we look at the pull factors for foreign investors, I think there's a risk we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because 50% of the respondents that we speak to say that they really value the legal and regulatory regime of the UK. Like, it's our standing internationally, the fact this is a safe, trustworthy place to do business is a pull-in. And when we add in that the biggest inward investor into the UK is the US, you know, sometimes the conversation around deregulation can be a little bit stark, and I think actually there's probably a nuance there. And so when we're looking at the kind of deregulation, I think the issue of smart regulation, and that we still hold the principles.
It was quite expensive when things went wrong last time.
Exactly, yeah. So I mean, there is definitely a balance to be had.
Thank you.
And skills?
And yeah, that's skills, absolutely. I think the PBS sector in some ways you can view almost as a skills factory. You know, people are so important, talent is so important to what we do. If I look at EY, you know, domestically, apprenticeships have been hugely important for us. We take on about 1,600 school leavers and graduates each year. We offer a level 7 apprenticeship, which is regulated by Ofsted, and Ofsted have rated it as outstanding. I think to Stefan's point, having the flexibility to use what was the apprenticeship levy that is now the skills levy to be able to fund those sorts of schemes is really important. And also from like a social mobility perspective, we've seen a great uptick in the diversity of people we can bring into the profession, and I think that's important for the attractiveness and sustainability of the profession. And I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding around apprenticeships. Like level 7 apprenticeships now, at the end of that, people will come out with an accounting qualification that is exactly the same as what a graduate would have done. And the Law Society are very enthusiastic about solicitor apprenticeships. I think and there was a question you asked in the other panel, if we look at the potential disconnect within government, I think what would be really helpful is joined up thinking. You know, DBT and in the Green Paper are very positive about apprenticeships. There's been slightly different soundings on the treatment of level 7s, and there's a bit of a question mark about how that will land, and that's for sort of Department of Education and Skills England. So I think everybody being around the table to say, what are we trying to do? And if we see this as a valuable vehicle, how do we encourage its use, rather than inadvertently thinking potentially in silos. I think there's still a little bit of government thinking that becomes quite siloed along departmental lines.
Great, thank you. That sets us up nicely for Gregor Poynton.
Great. So we'll see the forthcoming sector plan shortly on the business and professional and business services. Can you help us think about how should we judge that sector plan, both in of itself, but then on an ongoing basis, what success looks like? Perhaps to start, Kaur. Sorry.
Absolutely. So it's great to see that the government are leaning on expert and representative bodies. So the Professional and Business Services Council is heavily involved in formulating the sector plan, and I think it's really important that they're conscious that the SME voice and the regional voice is really loud here, because where there's real advantage, and it kind of strays into exports, is if we can help those SMEs and those hubs in Leeds, Manchester, Edinburgh, really thrive and expand, that's going to ladder up to the kind of growth that we need to achieve. We talk about what we want to see from a sector plan. I think let's be specific and let's be ambitious. Let's set some targets that we can actually measure. So what's the percentage of exports we want to see increasing along geographical lines? Or let's set some goals around recruitment numbers or levels of people we want to bring into the profession. I think something measurable always helps anchor back to success rather than ending up talking very broadly about it. I think there also needs for our sector plan the connectivity points that the Green Paper points to around skills. So we touched on apprenticeships and domestic skills, a really important part of our profession as well, and our ability to compete globally comes from the ability to be able to deploy international experts and bring people in where that benefits us. So a live example would be not just for PBS sector, but I'm sure for life sciences and AI. If you've got a world-class expert that you want to bring in from India, the US, Spain, the ability to have a skilled worker visa regime that recognises that you want to bring in an expert who can help upskill your teams and maybe work with you for a year and then go, really has an important international competitiveness element. And I'm still...
Is the Home Office incredibly helpful at the moment?
So I think that would be a question for DET to speak to the Home Office around how they want to approach that issue. But again, joined up thinking
you can
around
say yes.
I haven't had any direct conversations with them on it, so I can't comment.
Move down the panel.
Well, the industrial strategy, the Green Paper itself speaks about, how they're going to measure success, and actually agree with quite a lot of it. One is output growth. Will exports actually grow or not? In the advertising, we have around 18 billion of exports, and just because, and about 4.9 billion of surplus, just because it's currently successful, we would like to see that growth go further. Second one is productivity, but that's actually the point about connectivity between different sectors. None of our sectors exist in isolation. So a successful industrial strategy will see the points of connectivity and how that can bring further growth. And the third is about international position. Is UK more competitive or less competitive than the US, EU, and Singapore and other competitors?
I agree with pretty much everything that Ramon and Stevan have said. I mean, I think the PBSC under Ian Wright's leadership has been a great place where all of this has come together. And I think the PBSC is at its best when it has something that it can engage positively and constructively with government on. If we're looking at lessons from the past, we've kind of been here before, which is one of the reasons why Greg Clark's involvement is very welcome. But it goes back to predictability and instability. So we did have effectively a sector deal for the sector a while back that then sort of fell afoul of political movements in the government of the time. So having some clarity around the asks and specifics around the asks, and our view is that those should probably be relatively few in number, but clearly achievable and with clear targets and metrics around them. The creation of the Industry Strategy Council we very much welcome, but I think it remains unclear the extent to which, if this is going to be a 10-year strategy, the extent to which business will be consulted on that, brought in on that. Is that through the PBSC? Is that through other mechanisms? What forms of consultation will be utilised? Is it solely through the ISC, which I think would be a mistake? And then how is it kept live? Because the picture in 10 years' time in terms of where our major international competitors are versus where they are today is going to be very different. So we're going to need to have a plan that can adapt but retains its sort of direction of principle and strategy.
Great. Well, look, that's been extremely helpful. Thank you very much indeed for giving us your time and your expertise on that. That concludes this panel. Order. Order. Welcome to this third panel in today's Business and Trade Select Committee inquiry into industrial strategy. Thank you so much to our witnesses for joining us today as we look into opportunities around growth in the digital and technology sector. And Ellison Griffiths is going to open the questions for us today.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll start at that end of the table, but the question is to all of you. The government's number one mission is to be the fastest growing economy in the G7 by the end of its first term. How well do you think it's doing so far?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting us today. I think that I've seen a lot of ambition, and I think it's doing very well in terms of statement of intent. I'm exciting to see the productive outputs such as the AI Opportunities Action Plan, the focus on critical infrastructure and reframing that to include data centres to enable more of the investment in that front. I think we've got a great ministerial team, and I think and a great set of civil servants. I think there's been a real sense of ambition within that. I think we recognise that we exist within a really competitive landscape, so I would recognise that we've got a lot of work to do. I think a lot of work about how we can focus our energies, how can we make sure that we're planning for long term in terms of skills, how can we make sure we're being competitive globally, and then how can we sort of strengthen the opportunities. I think there are things that we can do which are quite sort of low-hanging fruit opportunities with regards to how we can improve our data collection within government, which I'm happy to talk about later. But as an opening start, I'd say yes, but with the opportunities ahead.
Thank you. Mr Morris, how about for Vodafone?
Well, I think, I guess they've made a good start, I think, in terms of identifying some of the areas of challenge and some of the opportunities. And I think the session today is to discuss the industrial strategy, which we are very supportive of. I think we're very optimistic about the future because we feel the technology that we're going to invest in to deliver a 5G network across the whole of the country, which is part of our guarantee for the merger with Three, which has nearly finished its competition process, means that we'll invest £11 billion and deliver that network to all of your constituencies, town, city and rural. And that being the case, I think there's a real opportunity for that technology to drive growth across the whole of the country. And it's not like a railway track where you have to wait till you finish building all of it before you can run a train. We can see benefits as we roll it out across the whole country. So look, we're really excited about the future and we really want the strategy, I think, to be a key enabler of that.
Thank you. Anthony, from a TheCityUK trade body perspective?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to go over this today. I think we recently did some polling of TechUK members, about 250 companies that we spoke to sort of get a sense of their current sentiment. And actually they were remarkably positive. About 77% of businesses said that they were optimistic about the UK tech sector. About 70% of businesses said that they were optimistic about the UK economy. Interestingly, SMEs were a bit less optimistic than larger companies. SMEs, I think, being sort of feeling the impact of some of the actions taken in the budget towards the end of last year. But broadly, the tech sector is an optimistic sector. It has grown, significantly over the last decade. It's now got a sort of $1 trillion plus kind of valuation for the UK. And I think there is a real kind of sense of optimism about what it can deliver in the future. Having said all of that, I think if you put the UK tech sector and the UK economy in the global context, that context is challenging for lots of reasons, which I think means that it makes the sort of industrial strategy itself only more important if we're going to leverage the growth that the tech sector itself can deliver as a sector, but also perhaps even more crucially, if we're going to leverage the growth that it can help support across the wider economy. And that's very much the lens through which we look at the industrial strategy.
I think that last point that you made is the key to the whole thing, isn't it? That it sits across the entire economy. So I believe you're speaking here on quantum, is that
Yes, that's
correct?
right, and good news, I don't plan to explain quantum computing or talk about cats that may or may not be alive or dead. I think for the purpose of this committee, the important thing about quantum is that it is incredibly hot right now. We've had $1 billion in new investment over the last 4 years, but 3 300 million in new private capital coming into quantum. It looks like AI did 5 years ago. And so I think from a policy perspective, what that means is, what do you wish you had done 5 years ago in AI that would have meant the UK had a bigger slice of the pie today? Do that in quantum today.
So I'm going to start at this then for the next part of the question. So specific to quantum in your case, but what more widely digital technology. But I think I'd encourage you all to speak to your own sectors. But obviously, Anthony can go more broad. What contribution do you think you will be able to make to the wider growth mission and the delivery of the industrial strategy?
Yeah, quantum will impact multiple pillars in the industrial strategy. It's a foundational technology. It will enable, in the life sciences sectors, drugs to be designed on computers instead of discovered in laboratories. Or in.
Is it worth just the rest of the committee just giving them a very brief overview of what is special about quantum, just in case anyone isn't aware of it or not?
3 sentences.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, the world around us is quantum mechanical. The way atoms and proteins interact follows the equations of motion of quantum mechanics. And quantum computers solve those equations. That means we can solve chemistry, we can solve for new types of protein-drug interactions. We can find new catalysts to address climate change. So it's a really transformational capability. If you look at other sectors like aerospace, I think it's a really nice analogy. We have the equations of motion of flight, and we have computers that can solve those equations. So we don't discover flight anymore, we design aeroplanes.
Why is now the moment that quantum will be able to make the leap that you were talking about AI having made in the last 5 years?
Yeah, so we've had 2.5 decades of progress in developing quantum computers. You've seen breakthroughs this last year from multiple tech companies, and that's really driving increased investment. So we're at the point now where the central challenge is quantum error correction, which is the problem that Riverlane solves. And this will enable a really rapid increase in the capability of the quantum computer. So getting to the point where we can, for the first time, solve some of these really big challenges.
Thank you. Anthony, do you want to take us more broadly?
Yeah, so I mean, look, the opportunity of technology is vast. It goes from being right at the forefront of the newest emerging technologies like quantum, all the way through to questions about how do we get, a small business that isn't yet connected to the internet? How do we get them to start using IT and technology in a way that can really drive their productivity and make them more successful as a local business in their local community? So the opportunities that technology presents are vast. They work right across this kind of huge spectrum. When we look at the UK as a whole, I mean, what we see is an economy with enormous strengths in technology, whether it's from leading edge research, or actually just having a kind of consumer base of consumers who are they like technology, they like using technology, and they tend to be kind of quite early adopters of technology. So we have a huge number of assets as an economy, assets that actually, frankly, lots of other economies around the world are very envious of, when they look at those strengths. But we're in a global context where the whole world is racing to compete to be, world-leading digital technology-led economies. And so what we can't do is be complacent about that. And what we have to do is to think really, across that kind of broad spectrum, what are the things that we need to do as an economy, as businesses, as governments, as public services, in order to make sure we're at the forefront. So there are key things around we've got to make sure that we've got the right investment coming in, whether that's public and private. We've got to make sure that we've got the right skills in place. We've got to make sure that we've got the world-leading kind of infrastructure that we need. We need the right science base. But we also need the right kind of legal framework, and we need the right regulatory framework to make sure there is trust and confidence in these new emerging technologies. And I'd add to that also, we need to work really constructively with our global partners as well, because these are global technologies. The expertise is spread around the world, and we need to kind of work, I think, constructively with other countries about how we drive that forward.
Thank you. And from a Vodafone perspective?
Yeah, I mean, look, so I mentioned that we're super keen to roll this network out. I mean, studies suggest that if we get it right, it's worth up to over 150 billion to the UK economy by the end of the decade. It will catch us up because at the moment we are falling behind. We're about 22 or 25 in EU countries in terms of 5G availability. So we want to catch that up. There is a specific, for those who noticed it, I obviously did, in the industrial strategy there is a 5G ambition of geographic coverage by to major population by 2030, and we want to deliver that and then go beyond it. So I think the key point then is, if we're going to build this network, how do we use it to realise the economic value? And that value can be both in the public and private sector, small or large businesses. But there, of course, it isn't just sitting in our own sector where we will be an enabler. So I'll be making the case for digital infrastructure today, where we will enable all of the technology you hear about today, but crucially, it will then enable all the other sectors as well. So there is a key question about how we build this network and use it. Probably talk a bit later about how we're struggling to build it at times, but the reality is, if we can use it well, we can really drive growth on the back of it.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
And from Arm's perspective, so Arm develops IP and architecture that sits underneath lots of the world's semiconductors. I think since we started this, about 1 million chips may have been made around the world which use Arm's architecture in some way or another. I think there's about 30 billion a year. So this is we underpin a lot of the world's technology. Arm-based chips are found in many of the world's smartphones, and can be found also in a range of products, whether it's sort of IoT devices, automotive, infrastructure, and other sort of sectors as well. And in terms of, so what we've done is, I think the growth mission, I think, really links to our relationship with Cambridge. So Cambridge has now become a globally recognised design semiconductor hub. If you get out the train at Station Road at Cambridge, you'll see the huge development of all the big tech firms that are now there.
Changing, and I suppose this is, what's changing with this industrial strategy that wasn't already happening anyway?
In terms of since the industrial strategy was written, so I mean, I think it's given that a lot of that is around infrastructure. It's quite soon to tell. I think in terms of what we're seeing is there's a lot more energy, a lot more emphasis on artificial intelligence. I think the link between semiconductors and AI needs to be better understood in terms of the fact that this is an area of UK strength. This also the wave of artificial intelligence we're seeing around the world. Everyone is trying to, the race for compute and sovereign compute represents an opportunity, and I think there's a way for the UK to lean into that. I think that particularly on the industrial strategy, I mean, honestly, semiconductors were mentioned once in the green paper, and that was, I think, disappointing, because I think given their role, we think they have a far more prominent role to be played there. And then if you look at the work we're doing on skills, I think that's something that we represent a lot. Obviously is basically what happens when you get 2,000 of the world's brightest engineers and put them in a room together. That's sort of what happens. And I think what we're looking to see is how can we develop more of this skill set. So we've done a lot of work into this space, and I think what we're seeing is uptake is actually in the UK is less than it should be. So if you look at, I think we developed some resources for online learners, and of our 85,000 or so learners who are using the programs and materials we create, about 4% are in the UK. So I think these are things which we see as opportunities to grow, but I think that's something that we should do a bit more.
Yeah. On a scale of 0 to 10, so literally one word answer from each of you, how optimistic are you about the prospects for the UK economy over the next 5 to 10 years? Let's start with you, Steve.
If we act quickly, it's a 10, but if we're slow, then 5.
7.
I'll go for 10 if we adopt the technologies that we're all talking about today. Otherwise, 8.
Depending on agility, I'd say 8.
Okay,
yep.
Good to know.
Very interesting.
I'm conscious of time. Are we still okay on time? Right, so we're going to look at sector planning next. So in which criteria would you use to judge the success of the government's forthcoming sector plan for the digital and technology sector? And in which parts of the sector does the UK have a comparative advantage or the potential to build one? I'll start with you.
So I think the main thing I'm looking for is that speed. So the time to act is now. We've had in Quantum a very clear strategy for the last few years. The community widely consulted. Most people think this is a great plan. I think now's the time to do it. So I think what I would be looking for is that sense of urgency, and that we're not going around another cycle of just consulting. It's really just make things happen.
And Anthony, I suppose I'd add you particularly to answer, in addition, how the government should decide which parts of the digital and technology sector it should be focusing on. We all know how many subsectors there are. I mean, technically there's 9, but there's a whole bunch of subsectors within that. Where should the government be focusing its energy to drive the growth?
Well, I think the government is absolutely right to put so much focus on AI, obviously. That's the kind of transformational bit at the moment. And there is, the UK is extremely well placed in terms of both in terms of the development of AI and the application of AI. I think the OBR has predicted that widespread use of AI could support raising productivity by 0.5 percentage point by 2028-29. So, there are really significant opportunities quite close at hand. But I think it would be wrong to just put all of your eggs in that one basket. I think the AI and quantum are intrinsically linked. AI and infrastructure are intrinsically linked. AI and skills are all intrinsically linked. So I think when we look at this kind of emerging kind of sector plan, I think what we'll be looking at is it kind of holistic and coherent? Is it looking at all the different factors that can have an impact on the success of the sector, not just in London and the southeast of England, but across the UK, and does it provide a mechanism that can really be a spur to private investment, which is ultimately going to deliver all of these benefits?
But you could also argue that AI is the technology that sits across the different subsectors, and so within, so if you took cyber versus cloud infrastructure, which are the actual sectors that you think, in this instance, perhaps AI is going to have the most output?
AI is the technology that plays across all of this. I don't think there are any limits to the potential for AI to drive innovation and transformation within sectors of the UK economy. There are other kind of growth technologies that I think are really important, and I think whether it is something like quantum, but I think we would resist sort of saying go and pick a winner, pick one particular area. I think that the whole point of the plan that we're looking for is something that looks at all of the inputs that can support the sector as a whole, I think.
Okay, that's helpful. Paul?
Certainly we think that digital infrastructure sometimes is the forgotten important child, if you like.
Can you repeat that?
So basically, digital infrastructure sometimes is assumed it will be there. And I think the strategy itself and all the sectors need to work with the industry to ensure that is the case. It shouldn't be naturally assumed that, for example, when you build a new housing estate or maybe even a new town, that the digital infrastructure will be in place to do that, or a new railway or anything, actually. And I think that conversation needs to be much more sophisticated than it is today. And then I'd like to see, I think, within our own plan, really thoughts around how do we make it easy to build. I think there's a lot of discussion about how you build traditional infrastructure, and that's difficult. I think there needs to be more thought on digital as well. We are part of the discussion. Maybe we need to be more central, because it is quite hard to build digital infrastructure in the UK like other infrastructure. So that means planning property law. I think we should look at modernising the frameworks on which we operate, which are largely in our world still a bit too 3G-ish. And we've just turned off 3G, so it'd be nice to catch up on the legislation and regulation. And as I said, we need to think about how we help and encourage adoption of new technologies. And that can be anything from smart procurement, procuring to innovate. I think maybe we need to do a bit more of that. And also smart ways of encouraging, say, small businesses to do small things. Just think about how we can encourage people to adopt. Possibly the odd incentive thrown in, but that's how you sort of get moving. It's quite hard to get people to adopt new technology. So I think the ways of doing that cleverly, working with the industry, would be really helpful.
Thank you.
And just from my side, I think, just to reiterate, I think I would be advocating the importance of the semiconductor design specifically, that area within the supply chain of semiconductors, which underpins all technology. I think that accounts for about 2/3 of the UK value in the semiconductor industry. You asked me about my level of optimism. Maybe it was the blue sky thinking, but I'm just going to downgrade it a little bit now, because I think on terms of, I'm hopeful, but in terms of optimism, I have to be honest, the UK level of funding available for semiconductors is just not competitive relative to its peers. So the US is 53 billion, the EU is 43 billion, and then the UK is 1 billion across 10 years. And so, that's just reality. I recognise the financial pressure that brings upon, but that is just a challenge that we do face. Within that 53 billion in the US, 11 billion of that is just on R&D. So.
We're going to speed up now.
Sorry,
because the clock is really against us. I'm going to bring in Matt Weston very briefly.
Mr. Morris, just very briefly, I'm interested to know what your thoughts are about, I think you said UK is 23 out of 25, was it, on 5G? How do you explain that? Was it the lack of an industrial strategy? And why is it we've got such paucity of coverage? And what does this new industrial strategy need to do to bring us up to speed?
So look, I think remember we're okay on 4G. So this is new, but we have been falling behind on the new technology 5. If I'd come to speak to you maybe 18 months, 2 years ago, I would have said market structure in the UK has held us back. For example, we just didn't have the scale to commit the £11 billion we want to invest in 5G, and the merger with 3 will solve that problem. So there was a market problem with scale for us to do that. So that was part of the rationale for that merger. So I think that was an issue. Now, whether the industrial strategy will cover those sort of areas, that's why I think not necessarily. That's more to do with, well, it might cover those sort of areas, but I guess that comes down to competition policy, and competition policy being linked to growth, which I think the government have been looking at. I think more generally, the industrial strategy itself should look at some of those areas I've just hinted at, which is, are we ensuring that we're making the best attempt to move quickly on the regulatory and policy structure and incentives and procurement to make sure that we're getting to common goals. So, for example, if the ambition in the industrial strategy around 5G is where we want to go, what are we doing to ensure that happens? That means that it isn't just a rollout of the technology, it's an adoption of the technology, and the adoption of technology will drive productivity across public and private sector, which should drive growth and better services. Plus the fact won't leave your constituents behind for those of you in more rural areas, which has been a problem before, with them being a bit left behind potentially. So that's the sort of challenge, I think, for the industrial strategy. And that's why we think we can catch up quickly on 5G. We can do it quickly because it's quite new technology, and we're in a good place to do it. But as I say, if we don't use it really smartly and get the industrial strategy to back that up, we'll miss out on the full opportunity of it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I held a business roundtable in my constituency of Tamworth in December, and I asked them, what are the opportunities that you think the government could provide? And one of the things that they said was public procurement, that's something that's an opportunity. But at the moment, it's also a barrier, because a lot of SMEs have basically not been able to bid for contracts. So I was wondering, what did you think about the opportunities for the government now, who are citing public procurement as a means to drive growth? Where do you think those opportunities are, particularly when we think about supply chains as well, and that everything is connected? Could you comment, maybe start with Peter and work along the panel?
On public procurement for SMEs, I'm probably less able to. I'm happy to pass over to others if they want to.
Or the importance of supply
Sorry.
chains.
Oh,
yeah, happy to take that. Look. Public procurement has long been seen as the sort of holy grail of growth. It feels like an obvious win-win if you can align what you're buying with companies that you're seeking to support and grow and so on. And I think, I think significant progress has been made in trying to make public procurement frameworks more open and friendlier to SMEs. But the reality is that SMEs continue to struggle to compete, in terms of public procurement. And I think it's an area where I think part of it can be that government and the procurers themselves can be very risk averse when it comes to working with smaller companies that they less used to working with. The relationship between larger companies and smaller companies can can be very positive when larger companies sort of bring smaller companies into their supply chains to help them to bid for bigger projects. But essentially, I think it's an area where government needs to kind of continue to focus. It's difficult, but I don't think. But it can be fantastically enabling. When you do create those opportunities for those smaller players to participate.
Just add a point to that. I think that the procurement regime probably has got an opportunity to move to procuring to innovate, which basically means you might have to spend a bit up front to save later. And if I give you an example, so we sell technology that can help you manage your energy bill, basically, through IoT technology. We did some research that suggested that a mid-sized town local authority, average-sized local authority, could save £400,000 doing that, reduce their energy costs, which obviously would be good for net zero. The point being is if you don't have the money to buy that in the first place, you can't get the benefit later on. And it would pay for itself, generally speaking. And I think there are examples of that where unless you are going to procure to innovate, you will just basically procure for what is the cheapest option you have there. And the trouble with that is you may not get broader benefits. And I think that's something that should be thought about, because I think part of the industrial strategy should look at that. And Anthony knows more about SMEs, and I think SMEs, again, that would give you maybe more options for SMEs. And I think then how do you ensure that technology can help SMEs to make the bureaucracy much easier to navigate? But I know the government have got some plans around that and are thinking about it. So I think that's a challenge over to them.
Perhaps I could just add. So I think in a high growth sector like quantum, procurement is a huge lever. The government has actually been procuring things slightly using existing mechanisms, so using things like SBRIs, and I think the leverage is roughly 10 to 1 in terms of private capital that's coming in. So every pound that's spent is bringing in an additional £10 in private investment, because those companies can then show to their investors, hey, look, somebody is willing to buy this, and sure, it's a first customer. But to make that work, I think it's challenging, because you do need to take a risk. You do have to buy something that perhaps won't work. But if you do, then it can have a huge upside. So I think the framework has to be right, and the critical thing is timing. It has to be on a timescale that makes sense for a small business. Like, you simply can't wait around for 2 years for some long, lengthy process. You don't have the money to spend on the administration burden. And so kind of lowering those costs, speeding it up, and being willing to take a risk, perhaps within a suitable bucket, then I think that's really the key.
Thank you.
One more.
Thank you. So my question was regarding the decisions, the things that drive the decisions that you make to invest and to grow, and where you make those decisions to invest and to grow. And I suppose to make it very concrete, let us, I think, Steve, you'll be investing potentially in the next generation of quantum. Paul, I know you'd be investing in 6G. I hope you're investing in 6G. And Peter, I guess you'll be looking to invest in the next generation of semiconductor design or design technology. So what are the key attributes of you're all based in the UK, but what are the, not necessarily hardcore in the UK, what are the key attributes of the considerations that determine that investment decision? And if there is both at a global, like a worldwide level, and at a UK regional level. Just briefly, I mean, we could take forever on this, but just what will they be? Do you see those changing over the next few years?
Yeah, so I chose to found Riverlane in Cambridge, and as Peter was saying, it's become this global hub of chip design, so they were the skills that we need. The alternative places were Silicon Valley and Texas. And the reason I found Riverlane in Cambridge was because the UK has had an amazing, effective strategy, industrial strategy in quantum. Started in 2014, big investments that led to a substantial strength in the academic base, and then a really smart approach of encouraging through Innovate UK, through the, I forgot the program name, but through the Innovate UK program, effectively grants that helped companies spin out of universities. And so that has led to the UK now having, to being second only to the US in terms of number of quantum companies and second only to the US in terms of capital raised. And so I think that skills base and the ecosystem were really the key to why Cambridge. And then I think the reason we stay here, because I mean now we are a global company, we sell, our customers are in the US and in Europe primarily. We have an office in Boston in the US. And the reason we stay here, I think, will be long-term commitments. So that stability of government saying, hey, we're going to stick to this. We think it's great, and we've got a 10-year plan to do this. So I think that's the key to keeping us here. And I think in part that's what other governments are starting to do.
Many quantum companies have moved abroad or been bought by foreign companies and as a consequence moved abroad. Is that an option for you?
The opportunity is to build the next tech leader in the UK. I think we should do that here.
Right.
I think the reason will be the skills base and long-term commitments.
By government?
Yes.
Great.
If I was to sort of list the factors, I think they're very, very consistent with what Steve was just saying. One of our biggest advantages is that we already have strong clusters of excellence, whether that's in research or whether it's in companies, and so that has a hugely positive. That ecosystem is extremely important for the UK. It's rooted in our universities ultimately, I think our universities play a really kind of fundamental role. But then you have access to skills, access to infrastructure, access to customers and partners. And that stable regulatory framework are all really vital. But the one factor that tends to drive companies out of the UK is usually access to capital. And this comes back to, I think, a constant theme today, which is about scale. Because this what's happening across the globe in terms of the fast evolution of the sector is all about scale, and that's one of the areas where kind of a lack of scale in terms of capital available in the UK means that companies tend to move abroad because they've got access to deeper capital markets and investors who ultimately think they can make a faster return on the capital deployed in those other markets.
Okay. Or is it access to capital? Or?
Well, we were a start-up in Newbury about 40 years ago, and we're still British, and we're based in Paddington, and also where we are in Southwark, so we're still here, and we're very proud of that. Look, I think for us, I think it's more return on investment is really important in markets, so you can make enough return to actually invest. That's very important. I think having stability is obviously important. Having the right policy and regulatory framework. I think there's a real opportunity within our sector to be a leader in the UK, because actually I think it all needs a bit of modernisation across the board, wherever country you're in. And we talked a little bit about falling behind on 5G. The reality is we've got a real opportunity to lead here if we get these levers right. And actually I have to say that I think you guys in government being supportive, making vocal noises of support are helpful as well. Don't underestimate that, because in a world where, it is a bit shouty these days, I think having people recognise the areas you need to work on and having an ambition in those areas and saying that publicly actually really helps. It makes people want to, work with the UK government and come up with solutions and invest in the UK as well. So those sort of things are probably very important to us.
Sure. And then for ARM, our greatest asset is our people. So it's fundamentally, it's the most incredible technology being developed, but it's fundamentally about engineers and people who choose to live in Cambridge because that is where they live and their families live. And I think it's a question of how can we make sure that Cambridge continues to be the headquarters that it is and sort of supporting its growth on that front. A lot of the work we're doing in the UK is around helping to identify what are the knowledge and skills that we're looking for the next generation to join our workforce. It comes down fundamentally to people. I think what I've noticed, particularly in the last few months, is countries are starting to set specific targets within semiconductor ecosystems to say. So Macron said, I think it was 40,000 electrical engineers within the next 5 years, and then in Malaysia it was 80,000, and I think that in India 85,000. And so I think the question is, how can we make sure that we are competitive, that we have that right talent pool? Again, it comes back to how are we seeing the materials that we've developed being used, and this comes back to that collaboration between schools up to university level, so that we are seeing that pipeline of also a diverse workforce. I think we recognise that only about 21% of electrical engineers in the UK are women, and that needs to be changed. Yeah. So I think we've got a lot of work to do. So it comes down to people fundamentally.
We've only got 5 minutes. We've only got 5 minutes left. So Gregor Poynton, and then I'm going to come to Anthony Bounce briefly.
Quick, Mr. Walker, just to pick up on your point on capital, look at mobilising capital and crowded in investment. But perhaps start with you, Mr. Stevens, if you don't mind. I mean, you mentioned the US £53 billion versus the UK's £1 billion, and one mention an industrial strategy. So how do you think the government should be crowded in investment when we're seeing a vast amount more money spent elsewhere?
So I think the intention to focus on your strengths is right. I think the focus also on how can we make sure the consistency between trade policy and industrial policy is also right. I think there are opportunities to make that, like there are things that don't cost very much which will help ease that. So a problem that we face is around processing timelines. So if we want to do an export license recently, it takes 2 months to do that between the UK and India. And whereas if we were in the US, that timeline would be 0. There are things like that which don't cost anything, which we can do quite quickly to help sort of ease that burden. I think beyond that, there are a lot more opportunities. I think I would heavily emphasise the importance of R&D, the importance of skills. That's long-term planning, and I think realistically, if you're looking at manufacturing, particularly in semiconductors, like the cost of building fabs is astronomical, tens of billions of dollars. So unless you have the capacity to put that level of investment, I would say it's better to invest where in the talent, in the people, where we have that real skill set. So that would be my focus. And one more point is also just in terms of consistency, the UK, in terms of competitiveness, a lot of it comes down to those investment incentives, so things like the R&D tax credits and patent box, which are also really helpful as well.
Mr. Morris?
I think for us, a lot of our challenges are known, and it's just, can we get moving to try and introduce some of the areas where we need change. And so if I just focus on one, that's to do with building the infrastructure, I would hope that in any planning changes, we're thinking about digital infrastructure within that, not just about building houses, which is incredibly important. So can we ensure that we can build the infrastructure that we need and we can do it once? So that's a bit like, can we build a bit higher with a bit more kit on masts or rooftops? And so that's identified, but can we go faster? It's really important. It's a devolved matter, and every nation has a slightly different approach, some better than others. So can we try and make that more similar across all nations? Because there is benefit to happen. And I'll give you one specific, is there's a property law change in our world, which is how we agree basically with landlords where we go on site. It was in the PSTI Act that was passed nearly 3 years ago. It would really help us move quickly to negotiate with landlords and roll out 5G. We're still waiting for it to be implemented. It is in, so I'm just giving you that as an example of things that are already on the books that just need to come in so we can get moving. The quicker we build, the quicker we can get the benefits from building this infrastructure.
Yeah, Mr. Walker and Mr. Brierley, slightly variant on that. Mr. Walker, I thought you outlined well the challenges we've faced, particularly in startups getting capital. What should the government be doing specifically there to try and help startups?
So I think there's quite a lot that the UK government can do to support startups. I think we believe that government first of all needs to really kind of focus on tech scale-ups in particular, because they are a phenomenal growth engine. If you're looking for a part of the economy that can drive rapid growth quickly, then start with your highest growth potential companies. So there'd be kind of scale-ups. I think you could then look at, okay, so how can you improve the operating environment for those companies? So you can look at what you can do to try to improve the situation around access to capital. There are all the Mansion House reforms and so on. You can look at where you can support them on skills, and but also we think there's a potential to provide more of a kind of concierge service for them to help some of those very, very high growth potential companies navigate their way through regulation. They're often working at the intersection of of different markets that can throw up kind of novel challenges, novel issues. But I mean, overall, I think we need to recognise that we are competing against China, we're competing against the US, we're competing against the Middle East with huge sovereign wealth funds. As a sort of the UK economy, we don't have massive levers to pull, and therefore we've got to be really smart about how we calibrate all of the smaller levers. And that's why I think the industrial strategy has to have this broad, holistic approach. You've got to look at what you're doing on the supply side as well as the demand side. You've got to look at the incentives that you're putting in place for private sector investment into innovation. You've got to look at the procurement piece. How can you use that to pull through investment? And you've got to really focus on the skills, both the very high-end skills, but also the kind of basic sort of digital skills to enable people to engage productively in a digital economy. And we've got to look at our whole approach to foreign direct investment and to trade. But we have to do all of these things. But yeah. The positive thing is I think that's what the industrial strategy is seeking to do.
Yeah. Okay, great. Antonia Vance.
So ending with you, Mr. Walker, how optimistic are you about the government's ability to deliver the industrial strategy? And it is an obsession of this committee as to whether government departments can work together effectively. Yep. So I'd appreciate any comments on where you think the difficulties and the tensions might be.
Playing a little game at the moment, so where 10 is perfectly seamless between different departments and regulators, and 1 is really very unseamless. Where is His Majesty's government today?
How could I put? Look, we work very closely with almost all government departments. There are times.
How closely do they work with each other?
Well, I was going to say there are times when we seem to have a better understanding of what each of them are doing than they seem to have themselves. However, that is not to criticise. I think the government's got an extremely difficult job of trying to pull all these complex pieces together. I think government is trying to move very fast, actually, in terms of moving from planning to action, which I think is critical. We certainly are fairly inundated, actually, by requests for engagement, which is really positive. But there is a lot to do to get all of this working together. I think the Industrial Strategy Council can play a really important kind of strategic role in terms of looking at the overall direction. But I agree that I think the cross-departmental coordination, I think, is the hardest bit. It's the bit that we really want government to focus on and work on. Because
if you were scoring them out of 10 at the moment, what would you give them at the moment?
I mean, I think I'm at about a 6, but I think they're making progress. And
room for improvement, then.
And absolutely. I mean, a huge amount to do, but I do think departments are working really hard, and I'm encouraged by that.
One line on this, Steven.
So I would say that they are, again, a 6. Yeah. The one thing I think is, so civil servants are great and fantastic to work with. I think we don't make it easy for ourselves in terms of understanding the truth of what is the reality of the economy working with. Yeah. SIC codes, I'm sorry to raise them, but need to be updated. Arms business doesn't fit easily within a SIC code. Yeah. If we think about it, you've got either engineering, other, or software development, which neither of them are perfect for us. However, if we were a goat herding company, then we would have our own SIC code. And I feel this is emblematic of that issue that we face, which is we're not capturing reality.
Leading on goat herding.
So I'm not suggesting apology to goat herders.
Steve, how joined office?
Yeah, I mean, I think DCIT's doing a great job in terms of bringing together the quantum strategy. The challenge for quantum, though, is because it impacts so many different departments. I mean, it's impacting defence, it's going to impact life sciences, advanced manufacturing and clean energy. It cuts across a lot of these pillars. And I think the challenge then is, well, does everybody think it's someone else's job to figure this out?
Yeah. So out of 10? Out of 10?
I'm going to give DCIT a 9 because I do think they've done a great job, actually.
Right, okay. Paul, very briefly.
Well, look, I think civil servants we work with across DCIT, Treasury, Business and others, we think we're really super, actually, if I'm honest. And we've worked really closely with them, and sometimes it's challenging, sometimes we work close together. We try and find these sweet spots where we both want to deliver. Ours is obviously 5G rollout. I think we shouldn't be surprised that departments will have different priorities, and I think the objective of the strategy in part must be, of course, to make government priorities out of the strategy, so when you get to departments, they have to know that that's their priority, right? And so I would say that I'm not going to mark them but I would give Dish it a high mark, but I'd say they haven't sat the exam yet. The industrial strategy is the exam, I think, and they need to sit that exam.
Very diplomatic.
Yeah.
Okay, we're out of time. That concludes this panel. That concludes this session. Order, order.
Thank you so much.